Hello all. The following video is for the purposes of revision, with the aim of presenting a brief recap of the poem, some analysis, some comments on poetic form, and finally some questions raised and potential links with other poems in the anthology. As always, nothing in this video will be more important than your own reflections on the poem. Recap. This three-stanza poem looks at urban planning, while examining our relationship with nature, with the past, and with ourselves. With images of the city, sea, and sky, followed by an extended dental metaphor, Cheng offers a vision of the modern world, with what is gained and what is lost. The planners themselves are never given a name or a face, or any identity whatsoever. And there is a growing suggestion throughout the poem that, to an extent, all of us are caught up in this relentless desire for progress and perfection. Analysis. The first line of the poem deals in intrigue, with the repetition in they plan, they build. There is already a hint of something sinister in this seemingly omnipotent but obscure entity, with all spaces within the sphere of their influence. Throughout the first stanza, there is an emphasis on the geometrical exactitude of the planners, with gridded spaces, the buildings in alignment, and the grace of mathematics. But with that word grace, we have the first touch of ambiguity, which ultimately becomes a defining aspect of the poem. With its connotations of the spiritual, the delicate, and the beautiful, that word grace distinguishes the architecture from mere mathematical rigour. In a poem that has so far seemed cold and even cynical, there seems to be just a touch of admiration in that word. As we shall go on to see, Cheng does not deal in pessimistic platitudes. So after what we might call a partially admiring nod to the magnificence of architectural splendour, the planners return in they build and will not stop, a line which, characterised by its unrelenting monosyllabic drudgery, is almost forcefully unpoetic, perhaps hinting at the unbending, ruthless practicality of the planners, against which even nature herself is retreating. In the final lines of the first stanza, nature herself, in the form of the sea and skies, is personified as a withering force. That word surrender, evoking as it does images of war and defeat, prompts the question of just how much is lost in this relentless drive for progress that the planner's endless building would seem to represent. Nature, so often seen by thinkers, poets, and artists of all kinds as a fount of creativity, is here a dying force. And so ends the first stanza, with the melancholy vision of nature beaten back by the bridges and buildings of the planners. The second stanza uses an extended metaphor, comparing the planners to a dentist. In their seeming pursuit of aesthetic perfection, the planners erase the flaws, the blemishes of the past. That word blemishes, with its emphasis on the cosmetic, lends a distinctly superficial feel to their endeavour, and then begins the extended metaphor with the mention of dental dexterity. Here, buildings are compared to teeth, with the planners being the dentist. In the first 4 lines of the stanza, we have the flaws, the blemishes, the useless blocks, and the gaps. All would appear to be genuinely undesirable, whether urban planning be the subject or our own teeth. Yet there is also something marginally tacky, artificial, and garishly ostentatious about that gleaming gold. A kind of shallow and soulless vision of what constitutes aesthetic perfection. And it is indeed perfection that the planners apparently seek, as the metaphor continues, with the next lines telling us that the country wears perfect rows of shining teeth. The decay is neatly obliterated, but the cause is never addressed. We are simply left with the sterile uniformity of those perfect rows. In a so far distinctly prosaic poem, the use of alliteration in the phrases dental dexterity and gleaming gold lend a surprisingly melodic element, as if a musical flourish might distract from the operation being performed. A touch of the hypnosis mentioned later, perhaps, with the planners playing the part of the Pied Piper, leading us all, we don't know where. Next comes one of the most striking lines in the poem. First, anesthesia, with the dentist dulling the nerves in order to operate. This would seem a natural and benevolent approach to limit the pain and discomfort of a patient. But the next two are slightly more enigmatic. Amnesia, suggesting memory loss, a disconnect with the past that might otherwise lead us to question the present. And then hypnosis, a state in which the patient has no control whatsoever, and is thus subject to the manipulation of the hypnotist. Larger questions emanate from such evocative words. What forces in society promote the desensitization and submission implied here? The monosyllabic simplicity of the next two lines is like an invitation to acquiesce. Don't think too hard, don't consider what's being done or why. Simply sit back and allow the surgery. All so that history is new again. Our lives in a kind of endless repetition. No lessons learned, no real progression, simply the nerves dulled, the memory wiped, and the mind usurped. Here Cheng would seem to suggest that progress, as envisioned by the planners, is just as superficial as the gleaming gold and perfect rows of shining teeth that characterize both patient and city. History, progress, and time constantly made new again, locked in cyclical repetition, become illusory. The piling will not stop sees the repetition of the earlier phrase, they will not stop, as if the very line itself, like the history just mentioned, is emblematic of that endless repetition. The same, simply made new again. The final lines of the second stanza reveal the destructive nature of this progress, the necessity to destroy in order to build. And now, as Cheng nears the ambiguity that ultimately defines the final stanza, it is worth exploring the anonymity of they, which next to the extended metaphor has become more problematic. They refers to the planners, who are compared to a dentist. But a dentist, in order to exist, requires a patient, and are we not all of us, therefore, compliant? The dentist is a planner, so are we, the patients. The architects and builders are planners, so are we, the clients. So the anonymity of the planners in the title ultimately allows them to be seen in a universal sense. They are not a singular group of people separate from you and I. In a sense, they are we, and we are they. And this is perhaps why Cheng's poem is not definitively critical. That but, which begins the final stanza, seems to signify a shift in perspective. For the first time in the poem, it is no longer about they, but about my heart. A shift to the first person. When Cheng says that he would not bleed poetry, it is as if he is suddenly being deliberately melodramatic, with that phrase recalling the famous cliché, my heart bleeds for you. If the tone of the poem might previously have been described as a kind of lament for all that is being lost, laced with suspicion and cynicism about the role of the planners, then here, for the first time perhaps, the tone appears to be almost mocking. Cheng has changed tack and tells us that despite the apparent protest of the previous lines, he does not wish to stain the blueprint of our past tomorrow. Fittingly, given the title, it is an architectural metaphor that succinctly emphasizes the relationship between the past and the future. The successive nouns in our past's tomorrow neatly encapsulate the problem that while they are considered to be separate entities, both past and future exist in a continuum, belonging to and defining each other. The absence of the present in that phrase perhaps suggests the idea that the present is only a momentary and ephemeral statement of our relationship with the past and future, ever changing. Thus, in the final 4 lines, it would seem that Cheng suddenly and surprisingly begins to distance himself from the idea that we are bound to some horrifically uniform, sterile, dystopian land in which all ties with the natural world and our own past have been systematically dismantled. The blueprint for that tomorrow might be flawed, for all the reasons explored. But nonetheless, he does not wish to stain it, because to do so would be to stain the very past that he reveres. Yet the tone of this final stanza is ambiguous. Does Cheng not wish to stain the blueprint because he thinks that it would ultimately be disrespectful to the past, or because he feels powerless to alter the blueprint? The ambiguity is crucial here because it prevents the poem and the feelings within it from being easily categorized as solely critical of urban expansion. This is honest engagement rather than simple protest. The final stanza is set apart from the rest and, coupled with Cheng's seeming ambivalence, illustrates the problem of displacement for the individual, pulled in both directions, the past and future, with obligations to both, wishing to advance but unsure of the cost, and desiring progression but uncertain of the direction. Form and structure. In the planners, it does seem strange that a poem which emphasises alignment, perfect rows, and all things gridded should have no rhyme scheme, no metrical pattern, no standard line length. In short, a seeming absence of the order said to be the aim of the planners. The poetic form would appear to deliberately subvert the very principles that the planners stand for. With this disparity between form and content, could there perhaps be the suggestion that the planners offer a kind of sterile vision that runs counter to ideas of creativity and spontaneity that we might associate with both human nature and progression? Some questions to consider. What exactly is being lost through the endless building described? Is the past necessarily destroyed for the sake of the future? Is there any kind of positivity to be found in the poem, or is it simply despairing? Some links to other poems. The planners might be compared with the city planners and Where I Come From, both of which explore the perfidious and frequently damaging nature of urban planning, while perhaps being contrasted with Composed Upon Westminster Bridge, which sees the city as a kind of heroic triumph. As an exploration of our relationship with the past, we might also consider a different history, and by extension, the proper role of the past in our lives. That's all for now. If you have found the video useful, then please do subscribe for more poetry revision with Mr Brooker.